Today's program is one of over 200 held each year at International House of Chicago and around the world. Whether it's a music or dance performance, a film festival, a cultural celebration, a lecture, conference, or symposium, International House presents programs that advance cross-cultural understanding and promote civic discourse on community, national, and world affairs. These programs would not be possible without the support and participation of organizations across our campus and around the city of Chicago. For today's program, I'm especially grateful that the Center for Latin American Studies is presenting this program here at International House as a part of its Latin American briefing series, and that we are co-sponsoring this program. On behalf of the University of Chicago and the global International House community, I want to welcome you all again and thank you for coming out here on this snowy day. And now I'd like to introduce Maurizio Tenorio, who is a professor of history here at the University of Chicago, to begin today's program. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. As Professor of History and as Director of the Center for Latin American Studies, I'm happy to welcome you to this event we have organized. We try to keep up with both historical and current events in the region, and one of the issues that we personally, I and many of my colleagues in political science and economy are very concerned is with the issue of inequality. And the two most successful economies, we will have another soon coming on Brazil, but the two most successful economies in terms of development in the 20th century and 21st century in terms of economic growth are those of Brazil and Mexico, even worldwide. However, in terms of inequality, they are examples of radical, very unequal distribution of income. And we want to analyze these context with the different colleagues that we have who have come to campus to share with us their points of view. I'm not going to introduce the speakers to you. Our distinguished doctoral student, Tania Islas, will do so in due time. I'm just going to, on behalf of the University of Chicago and the Center for Latin American Studies, to thank our sponsors, co-sponsors in this event, which are the International House, the Center for International Studies, the Program on the Global Environment, and the CAT Center for Mexican Studies. The event will follow is going to follow the following logic. Each speaker is going to briefly have 5 to 10 minutes to explain a point. Then Tania will be in charge to organize a dialogue among them, and then it will be open to the public to dialogue with them. Unfortunately, being the host, one doesn't have the advantage of staying all the time. I have to teach, so I'll be leaving around 1:20. Don't take offense of this. It's just I have to teach. Okay, Tania.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Hi, everyone. Well, thank you, Mauricio. It's my pleasure to be here moderating this roundtable discussion entitled The Challenge of Inequality in Mexico. Whether it is talked about or not, inequality is everywhere in Mexico, from daily lived experience to policy reports that remind us that Mexico is the most unequal country in the OECD, to news about the drug war, whose fallout disproportionately affects some of the poorest regions in the country. So in this roundtable, we ask our panelists and all of you to reflect on the problems and challenges that inequality poses in Mexico. Before opening the floor to our panelists, let me briefly introduce them. Here to the right, we have Luís Felipe López-Calva, who holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. He became lead economist and regional poverty advisor in the World Bank's Europe and Central Asia region in September 2013. Prior to this, he was lead economist at the Poverty, Equity, and Gender Unit in the bank's Latin America and Caribbean region. Mr. López-Calva has served as chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at UNDP in New York. He has been a visiting scholar at the Stanford Center for International Development and at the World Institute for Development Economics Research in Helsinki. among other important positions in Mexico and around the world. His publications and research interests focus on labor markets, poverty and inequality, institutions, and development economics. To my right, we have Gerardo Esquivel. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. He is currently a professor of economics at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Previously, he worked at El Colegio de México and as a researcher at the Harvard Institute for International Development. He has been a consultant for the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, and the Central Bank in Mexico. He also worked as economic advisor for the Secretary of Finance in Mexico City, and in 2005 he was awarded the National Prize for Research that is given annually by the Mexican Academy of Science for the most outstanding scholar in the social sciences in Mexico, under 40 years of age. And he has recently received the National Prize in Journalism as well, and the National Prize in Public Finances. Here sitting amongst you, we have Fausto Hernandez Trejo. He's professor of economics at Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, CIDE, in Mexico City, and is currently a Kellogg visiting fellow at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Hernandez has taught at the University of Chicago, the Ohio State University, the University of Texas at Austin, and Purdue University, and has served at the Mexican Stock Exchange and for the Mexican federal government, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the government of Mexico and Guatemala. His research interests include public and international finance, and particularly exchange rates, public debt management, credit ratings, finance of subnational governments, and tax reform. Currently, Dr. Hernandez is studying how the fiscal decentralization process in Mexico has impacted poverty at the municipal level. Finally, to my left, we have Guillermo Trejo, who's an alumnus of this university. He is currently Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame and Faculty Fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Dr. Trejo's current research seeks to explain the rise of organized crime, its transformation into criminal insurgencies, and its impact on the quality of democracy. He is author of the book Popular Movements in Autocracies, Religion, Repression, and Indigenous Collective Action in Mexico, and is currently working on another book, provisionally entitled Votes, Drugs, and Violence, Democratization and Organized Crime in Latin America. Okay, well, to get our discussion going, each of our four panelists will have between 5 to 10 minutes to deliver an introductory statement around the following open-ended questions. Why, despite macroeconomic stability, urban growth, and the expansion of social services, does social inequality persist in Mexico? Why have strategies to tackle it failed? And what are the social, economic, and political consequences? So I give the word to Mr. López. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the university and Mauricio and all the organizers for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I will try to use my time, my first intervention, hopefully less than 10 minutes, to give an overview of certain dimensions of and trends of inequality in Mexico. And first, I would like to say why we care about inequality. I mean, we can have many normative reasons of why we care about inequality, but I will give you also some instrumental reasons why we care about inequality, and I think it will be important to say this up front before we start the discussion, so we have some idea of why we're talking about this. Then I will talk about three dimensions, because when we talk about inequality, it's very important to define what exactly, in which space we're measuring inequality. So I will particularly talk about these three aspects. One is I want to talk about inequality in outcomes, mainly income. I'm going to give some indicators of equality of opportunity in Mexico, and at the end I will talk more briefly about wealth inequality. So we can spend the whole day talking about the normative reasons why we should care about inequality, but I'm going to give you, in addition to normative reasons, there are instrumental reasons to be concerned about inequality. As the literature has shown, under certain conditions, and it is important to say that under certain conditions, that is why these are not made as very strong statements. We use, we say it may affect growth. So we know that inequality may affect the capacity of an economy to grow. We know for sure, for certain, that same level of growth is less effective in reducing poverty when there is high inequality. So inequality reduces the capacity of growth to impact poverty. Under certain conditions, inequality may also increase social conflict. And here it is also important to say, and we will have time to discuss that when we open for the debate, that remind you that not all inequalities are born equal. And it's important to know what is generating the inequality in order to understand its effects. And also it may distort policy making. I will show you this, particularly when we talk about the concentration of wealth at the top, and we talk about how that can may weaken institutions and the regulatory capacity, and may distort also policy making. So when we talk about, I want to talk about 3 dimensions of inequality. I'm going to try to go relatively fast to leave open for discussion. So let's talk first about outcomes, and mainly I will talk about income. One important message is Mexico followed the trend of the Latin American region during the last decade, during the last actually 12 years, in which inequality has been decreasing, inequality in incomes has been decreasing. However, but by the way, Latin America showed decreasing inequality when inequality was increasing in other parts of the world. So on average, in Mexico, the Gini coefficient measured in the household surveys fell by 0.7% per year. But as you can see, it's not Mexico, which is here in red, it's not the best performer in the region. So inequality decreased in Mexico, and I'm going to show you why there may be reasons to be concerned about this decrease in inequality. So it's not the best performer, first. Second, it's also the only one in which this decline has come to an end and actually has reverted. Contrary to what happens in other countries in the region. So not only in Mexico, so if you take, I show here Gini coefficient for the Latin American region with and without Mexico. And basically, if you take the Latin American region, the stagnation of the decreasing trend in the Gini coefficient is basically explained by Mexico. So if you take out Mexico, the trend continues, but if you put Mexico in the sample, actually the trend flattens. And so mainly the effect of Mexico, particularly after 2008, is what is basically implying this decrease. I mean, this reversal in the trend in Latin America. This is the evolution of the Gini coefficient in Mexico. So as you can see, it was falling, and it bounced back. As it was said before, Mexico is the most unequal economy in the OECD, even though very closely followed by Chile. So actually, we should be very supportive of Brazil entering the OECD. So we would be actually the most unequal in that group. Now, if one looks at what explains first, I'm going to talk about what explains this decline in inequality. There are mainly 2 reasons. One is the fiscal policy became more progressive, particularly through the redistribution through conditional cash transfers. So the incidence of public spending became more progressive, and that has had an effect on income inequality. And the second element is a compression in the wage structure in the labor market. So wages became less unequal. Now, if we take see the effect of this reduction in inequality in terms of the effect on the growth of the middle class, in the case of Mexico, in the case of Latin America, about 20% of the increase in the middle class is explained by the reduction of inequality. But if we take a look at how the middle class evolved during the last 12 years, Mexico is again the worst performer in the region. So even though the middle class increased a little bit as a share of the total population, we can see that it doesn't follow the very successful path that the Latin American region showed. This is Latin America as a whole, and you can see that by 2008, there is this historical crossing in which the middle class, as a share of the total population in Latin America, the middle class becomes larger than the share of population in poverty. And that trend continues until 2012. In Mexico, that reversal takes place around 2006, but then there is a reversal in the trend. And then, particularly due to the shock of the crisis, so contrary to what other Luises have said in Mexico, actually Mexico is far from being a middle-class society, particularly if you compare with the performance of the rest of Latin America. Two quick comments about labor markets, because I think now we're realizing that part of the reason why the inequality has fallen in Mexico is because this compression in wages, and it may not be the very good news, particularly because it's driven not only by an increase in wages for the unskilled workers, but actually in Mexico the level of wages for tertiary educated people, for people with tertiary education, are falling. So wages are falling for tertiary people with tertiary education, the unskilled are increasing, and that explains the compression. But there's an issue of concern why the wages are falling for people with tertiary education. We see this graph, this comes from a paper I'm writing with Santiago Levy. We see the red line is the increase in years of schooling, average years of schooling of the labor force. So there has been an important change in the schooling composition of the labor force, yet in this case the blue line is informality. So you would expect that more educated people will imply more informality. It's not the case. Actually, informality doesn't change at all. Here you see in the panel at the bottom, you see the change in the composition of the schooling composition of the labor force from 89 to 2012. You see a clear improvement in terms of the schooling of the labor force in Mexico, which is not reflected in the top panel. In higher wages. Actually, wages are stagnated. Okay, this is average wages in the survey. And this is just to show, as you can see, if you do it by quintile, that you can see that returns to education are totally flat for the three first quintiles, and there is only some returns that show for the top quintile. But for the first three, for 75% of the population, returns to schooling are basically flat. So that's a matter of concern. So very quickly, let me show you something about PISA scores. Mexico is not only a bad performer, but also there is a huge heterogeneity in terms of, so this is another dimension of inequality, which I call equality of opportunity, because it's related to intergenerational mobility. And you can see that if you are born in Guerrero or Chiapas or so, you almost surely your level of education is going to be very poor. So there are other drivers of inequality. So that would tell you that the things we observe in terms of income generation capacity of the households may not change, or may not change for some people in the country because they are acquiring very low quality education. And this is just a graph that shows that Mexico is way below average in terms of PISA performance, and way above average in terms of the fact that performance is explained mainly by the socioeconomic background of the students. So basically, the socioeconomic background of the students has a strong influence on the outcome. Finally, and this is 30 seconds on this, the third dimension I wanted to briefly show some indicators is in terms of wealth inequality. If you see the growth of the billionaires in Mexico is not as fast as it has been in other countries, yet the stock, the level of wealth of these people has increased. In Brazil, for example, the number of billionaires in Forbes doubled. In Mexico, the number doesn't grow that fast, but the amount of money that these people has made increases a lot. You can see here, this is the evolution of all the Mexican billionaires as measured by Forbes. There is a very large increase, completely unrelated to the growth of the economy, which shows, of course, concern about the fact that in some sectors there may be extra normal profits. And in a study that we did in 2007 with Michael Walton, we saw that companies that are related to these billionaires in the Forbes list were more likely to show looking at all the resolutions of the Antitrust Competition Commission, we saw that they were more likely to be found, guilty of abusing monopolistic power, but also were systematically more likely to get legal protection through amparos, what is called an amparo, so the suspension of the sanction. So there seems to be some indicators of capture in terms of the capacity of these billionaires to be protected from resolutions that try to undermine their monopolistic power. So these are just some indicators to motivate discussion. So let's move on, and we'll come back to this later.
Yes, definitely, we'll come back. Thank you. Gerardo?
Well, first of all, let me thank the University of Chicago for having me here and having invited me to this very interesting discussion. And I'm glad that in Chicago people is concerned about inequality in Mexico, because in Mexico people doesn't seem to be that concerned about inequality, surprisingly. So it's good to come to Chicago for that reason as well. So, and I'm glad to be back at the University of Chicago, because I was a thinker visiting fellow 4 years ago. So I'm very happy always to be here, even if it's snowing. Let me let me start with this poem by Efraín Huerta, which is last year was the centenary of his birth, and I think this summarizes a little bit of what we are concerned about inequality. I should have put a translation here, but I thought that many people here could read in Spanish. But this is probably what summarizes a little bit of the idea of what's going on in terms of inequality in Mexico, that there are always more and poorer people and less but richer rich people in Mexico. So that's the basic idea of this poem by Efraín Huerta, which is entitled "My Country, Oh My Country." And just again to give you an idea of, this is what Luís Felipe mentioned in terms of the level of inequality in Mexico. These are the OECD economies, and these are two indicators of inequality. One is the traditional Gini coefficient, which is the blue line, and another indicator of inequality, which is the income that goes to the 19th people located in the 90th percentile of the distribution, so at the top of the distribution, with respect to people in the bottom part of the distribution, at the 10% level of the distribution. So that's the red bar. And as you can see there, Mexico, together with Chile, are the two countries with the largest levels of inequality. Depending on which indicator you want to use, either Mexico or Chile are the most unequal countries in the OECD. So this is what we know about inequality in Mexico. Mexico is very unequal. Mexico is sort of an average country in terms of inequality in Latin America, but Latin America is the region of the world with the largest level of inequality. So in that sense, Mexico is a very unequal country. But one thing that is important, and this is related somehow to my, also affects the way in which I have studied this issue of inequality, is that what we know about inequality in Mexico and about inequality in many parts of the world has to do or comes from estimates from the household surveys. So all of this, what we are saying, more of what Luís Felipe said, is also based on household surveys. But the thing that we now know, for the work of many people, but particularly by the work by Piketty recently and others, is that household surveys are not necessarily capture the level of the dimension of inequality, because they tend to overlook the richest people in any economy. So the sample on which these estimates come from is biased somehow, in the sense that usually do not get information about people in the top part of the distribution. And in that sense, probably what we have about many countries in the world, particularly countries like Mexico with large levels of inequality, sort of underestimates the level of inequality. So. This is important because when I started working on inequality, just a few years ago, and I did some papers on that. Part of those has findings that are somehow related to what Luís Felipe described. I wrote 3 papers between 2010 and 2012, which are relatively optimistic in the sense that what we found there, I wrote these papers together with Nora Lustig and John Scott and others. What we report there, if you read those papers, we are relatively optimistic in the sense that we found this reduction in inequality that Luís Felipe was talking about. And we also sort of decompose where this reduction in inequality was coming from, and we found basically 3 elements. One is the compression on wage distribution that Luis Felipe was talking about. Second, remittances. Remittances was very important because remittances coming from Mexicans living in the US, sending them mostly to people living in rural areas where the distribution is worse, sort of help to make the distribution less unequal. And third, the change in social policy, particularly the program Oportunidades, or Prospera, which is as it's called now. This program, which has a better a focalization process on the poor, or better targeting on the poor, sort of help to reduce inequality, particularly in rural areas as well. So remittances, social programs like Oportunidades, conditional cash transfers programs like that one, and the compression on wage inequality helped to reduce inequality in Mexico in the past few years, and this is something we described. But we also found that this has come to an end at some point. So in that sense, seemed to be like a little bit optimistic about the trend on inequality, although we were concerned with the fact that it was starting to stop and probably even reverting, as Luis Felipe was mentioning. But then when this trend or this change in the focus on inequality, thinking not just in terms of what is reported on the household surveys, but also trying to think about what happens with the rest of the distribution that we usually do not capture through these household surveys, then I switch a little bit the topic of my research. And now I'm going to show you just a few results which are more or less in line with the work that Piketty, Saiz, and others have done concerned with the income of the rich. And I have started working on the incomes of the rich and what's going on. So, and I think that it's important because that is not captured in the household surveys, and that tells us a very different story. So I'm just going to show a few data of this work that's just ongoing process. One is, for example, this is one measure. We might discuss whether that's the right measure or not, but this is the fortune of the 7 richest people in Mexico, according to the Forbes reports, and as a percentage of GDP. So people might claim that this is not a right comparison because we are comparing a stock of wealth vis-a-vis a flow of income, so stock versus flows. But in any case, it's interesting to see that the wealth of at least the 7 richest people in Mexico has grown much faster than the total income in Mexico. So that's why, as you can see in the past, particularly starting in 2003, that indicator started to pick up, and now it has reached 10% of GDP. That's the wealth, the fortunes of the 7 richest people in Mexico. This includes not only Carlos Slim, but also Balleres, which is in the mining sector, Larrea, which is also in the mining sector, and others. So, Litam, Balleres, yes. So 10% of GDP belongs to this to the 7 richest people in Mexico. That's the level of wealth that they have. But the point is how has increased so rapidly in the past few years. So suggesting that these measures that we got in terms of reduction in inequality are in some sense incomplete, maybe. Just to make comparisons of flows versus flows and not just stock versus flow, what we did here is just to see, for example, something which is, as you can see, it's sort of follows pretty much the same trend. This is the previous one, this is the new one. And this is the thousands, in thousands, the number of workers that someone like Carlos Slim could hire just using the annual return on his fortune. Okay, so he has his stock of fortune. We assume like a real return on that, 5%, and he uses. Let's assume that he uses that returns to hire workers for a year. How many can he hire if there were minimum wage workers? So this is the number. This is in thousands. That means that in this year, last year, he could hire as much as 2 million people, earning minimum wage for 1 year without having a reduction in the level of his real fortune, in real terms, okay? Just using the real return on his fortune. So, and then I have this table which comes from a book written by Branko Milanovic, where he tries to answer the question, who is the richest man for all times? And this is a similar exercise to the one I just showed you, and he finds that it's Carlos Slim. For one reason, and this is related to inequality, because he is the person that could hire the largest number of people 2 times, and that is just the outcome of him being very rich, but also living in a country where people earn very little in general, in average. So he can hire many more people than, for example, Bill Gates or people like Henry Ford or Carnegie or so, other the robber barons. Okay. So, and then we come to the, but this is just, these things are a little bit anecdotal. So there's this one person, the 7th richest person in Mexico, and so on and so forth. But so instead of doing that, we try to estimate, to come up with an estimate of how much belongs to the top 1% of the distribution in Mexico. And that's interesting because 1% of the population in Mexico is 1 million people. So it's a lot. So we're talking about different senses of magnitude. We are not talking about one single person or the 10 richest people in Mexico. We are talking about the 1%. As I said, it's 1 million people or 200,000 households. And how much of GDP belongs to this portion of the distribution. Here we compare with other countries for which we have estimates. This is an estimate. And what we have, this is ranked in ascending order, and Mexico is at the very bottom of the distribution because the top 1% of the income distribution in Mexico captures 21% of total GDP. Being of this group of countries, the country with the worst distribution in that sense, in the sense that the top 1% captures a higher share of income. And now, this is my last slide, which is part of the discussion we might have, is that part of that has to do with this level of inequality in Mexico is so high because the role of tax and transfers, for example, is very ineffective. This is the Gini before tax and transfers, vis-a-vis the Gini after tax and transfers. And as you can see, Mexico and Chile, which are, for you is in the extreme right, is basically the same before and after. Whereas for other countries, it really makes a difference, the system of tax and transfers that they have. So we have a problem in terms of the system, the fiscal system, so that tax and transfers are not good in terms of reducing inequality in Mexico, and we have pretty much the same pattern of income distribution before and after the tax system starts to work. So this is one of the reasons why, responding to the question that was posed at the beginning, the level of inequality in Mexico is so high. Other things had to do with what Felipe was mentioning in terms of lack of competition that makes that people that has access to these monopolies really can extract rents from the economy. And that's why this is precisely what's happening with the richest people in Mexico. So that's why that has been increasing substantially in the past few years. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation for, and especially for the Center of Latin American Studies here at the University of Chicago. It's always nice to be back also. I think I'm going to just take off from the place where Gerardo just mentioned. The first thing that we have to see is that yes, you can see that the country is very unequal. There was supposed to be some trends right here. Income inequality has declined in Latin America, supposedly the most unequal region in the world. Gasparini argues that this is not necessarily the case. He says that the sub-Saharan Africa is these days more unequal than Latin America. But anyway, that's not necessarily the main point here. Many factors may explain the decline, and the decline can be aggregated in changes in labor income, which they account for like 2/3, according to Levy and Shady, and only 1/3 coming from public policy. Some doubts for the future in the region have been in place. The first thing is that yes, labor income was important in Latin America, but we measured that in the decade where we had a commodity boom. If this commodity boom, is basically deflated, then there will be some, questions whether this decline will be sustained or even persistent. The other one, people are now arguing that the social programs, the target social programs, which have been somehow effective in relieving poverty, the thing is that do they have extra power or extra gasoline to close the gap? Many people are right now, some research going on, are just saying, well, I think it's not that they are not working, they worked and they are working well, but in terms of income inequality, they will not necessarily yield higher returns. So that's basically the conclusion that they have. So what would be next? I don't want to question, which I completely agree with what has been said right here. The question is what to do to really get a nice income distribution. Let me just show you this graph. This graph can be very unreliable. I took all the data from a John Scott paper, and John Scott in turn did some library research and got different estimates for the 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth. But if you actually trace a trend, you will see that income inequality all over the recent history in Mexico is basically stagnant. Some increase, some decreases, but at the end, we have basically the same level of income inequality. So this is a long-term thing, and sometimes long-term matters also when we are talking about income inequality. So, and then let me just take what Gerardo said. Gerardo just said that this shows basically the Gini coefficient with and without social programs in different OECD countries. What you can see right there is that Chile, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and Mexico, their social policy doesn't really help to the decline of income inequality. They don't really help. When you take a look at some other countries, this is basically the same graph that Gerardo showed. When you take into account the welfare system that Germany, Italy, Poland, Portugal, etc., European countries have, then income inequality actually declines abruptly. It's not that went from 0.50 to 0.48. No. They go from 0.50, let me just take care of Portugal, let's say. 0.50 goes all the way down to 0.38. That's an important figure. What is the difference between those countries and these other countries? Supposedly, the social expenditure in most Latin American countries have been praised by many international organizations in the sense that this social expenditure is targeted. And it's reaching the poor, which I tend to agree. But there's something else we need to do. There's something that these conditional cash transfers are doing for the poor. Yes, positive things. But they are not helping out to decrease income inequality. I think the difference is a universal social security system. That is basically what explains that decrease with social expenditure and with no social expenditure. So this is by country. This is what Gerardo just showed. Let me just go over the textbook case. So the recipe for that would be increase taxes to the rich or inheritance You know, if you really do that, you will have the disposable income of the rich going down. And if you use the resources that you get from those taxes on good social programs, then you have two forces that will actually help you out to reduce the income inequality. I mean, that's the textbook case. Now, let's go to the very positive thing. What we need to do, and what is exactly the options that Mexico would have. From the tax point of view, we have a very weak institution, political institutions, and very weak IRS. Let me just say, the tax collector is very weak. And it's a country that 2/3 of the population, let me just show you right here, 2/3 of the populations are informal. It's very hard to tax these guys. And it's much harder to tax the very rich guys for the very same reason that they will not open the door when a guy performing the survey for the INEGI is just the same reason. They can hide very well. You know, tax avoidance has been shown to be regressive. If there's something regressive, it's tax avoidance. The very rich guys, I mean, I can tell you, I'm a guy of principles, and my principles actually say it would be much better to tax the rich. However, in Mexico, I think these guys would escape very easily from the IRS. Because there's informality. When we talk about informality, sometimes we think in terms of street vendors and things like that. No, informality also includes a lot of rich guys. Lots of rich guys. So what is the alternative to really decrease that? I'm just going to finish. Don't worry. So
I'm being impressed.
yeah. What is the alternative to me? Well, I think with a universal social security system that Levy proposed in 2008, and later on my colleague Arturo Anton Levy and myself did some numbers on that. We reached to the conclusion that having a universal social security system in Mexico would decrease Gini all the way down to 0.33 or 0.37, depending on some other things that I don't want to talk about because I just have 1 minute. And this would be financed with the VAT. This is very questioned because VAT per se, and we all know, is regressive. Yes, it is regressive. But if you, on the other hand, use these resources to give them back in the form of a social security system, you would get in the net this decrease. That's why people oppose, because VAT is not well seen in Mexico, because it's better to tax the rich. But taxing the rich in Mexico, with the political institutions we have, with the quality and corruption we have in the IRS, in the Mexican IRS, with the level of informality we have, I think we are going to crash on a wall. I think it's better to do that. And I think the difference between those countries, European countries, and the Latin American one, is because of a universal social security system. If we actually introduced a universal social security system, financed with this very horrible and satanized increase in VAT, I think with the calculations we have, Gini coefficient would go down all the way at least to 0.37. Thank you.
Well, let me join my colleagues to thank the Center and the University for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back. I made an effort to have a bit of a maroon color with my tie, so I blend in. It's not easy to be the last one after three of the most talented Mexican economists just spoke, but I'll make my best. I'm the only non-economist, so I'm going to talk about non-economic issues of inequality. And let me just start by building on a finding, something we've heard here, and that's the sticky nature of inequality in Latin America. I think it's very telling, the figure that Fausto was showing, that for a time span of 50 years, the Gini index of inequality has gone up and down, but the long-term trajectory, the steady state, is pretty much like that. If you look at other countries in Latin America, Chile would be the same. And it really forces us to think, Chile has tried everything, dictatorship and democracy. They've tried socialism and capitalism. They've had democracy with a right-wing or a left-wing government. They've tried everything, and levels of inequality are pretty much the same. Mexico has tried everything from, you compare characters from López Portillo to Peña Nieto, from, it was under the PRI, under the PAN. We've tried pretty much everything. I know we're still missing one party to rule Mexico, but things are pretty stable. And then that really forces us to think about whether we're capturing all the dimensions of inequality. And let me just add a few additional dimensions to the very persuasive information we received about income and class and wealth. And let me just throw in and identify what is really the elephant in the Mexican room of inequality, which is race-based discrimination. And what's really behind this presentation is an idea of inequalities as multiple inequalities that overlap. So I tend to think of income, wealth, but also ethnic, race, gender inequalities. And to the extent that they overlap, they create very stable, robust equilibria that are very difficult to break, even if you try capitalism, socialism, right and left, and everything. So we probably need to look a little bit beyond that. What I want to try to persuade you in the next 8 minutes is to start looking at questions of race. And let me just start with this very stylized image of Mexican society as a society ranked by class and ethnicity. This is what we typically think of a country like Mexico, with 3 ethno-linguistic groups: white, mestizo, indigenous, and then the rich, middle class, and the poor. And so far, or up to this point in the social science in Mexico, we recognize that there's class-based inequalities and that there's class-based discrimination, and pretty much everyone would agree on that. It's been only recently, in the last 20 years or so, that even economists have, sorry to say even economists, but they have accepted, recognized, even the World Bank has recognized that there's ethnic-based inequality, and there's great work on inequalities between indigenous and non-indigenous populations coming from Sakharopoulos and others from the World Bank. And we have pretty strong evidence showing that the difference between indigenous and non-indigenous persons, so indigenous and the rest of society, in terms of educational attainment, access to education, access to any social public good or service that you could imagine, there's always going to be that gap between indigenous and non-indigenous is going to be significant. So up to this point in the social science in Mexico, we say class-based inequality, ethnic-based inequality, but we don't talk much about race. It's a thing of the colonial past. We don't talk about it. It makes us uncomfortable, specifically someone like me who's going to introduce the question of phenotypical features and skin tone. But if we unpack mestizaje to some extent, for a non-Mexican audience, mestizaje would be the equivalent of the middle class in the US. Everyone is middle class in the US. Well, in Mexico, everyone is mestizo. Everyone, if you are indigenous, but you leave your village, you go to the city, you no longer educate your kids in indigenous languages, you dress like me, or like anyone in this room, then you're mestizo, even if you remain racially indigenous. And that's the beauty of mestizaje. It's not a concept, it's not a concept that involves racial mixing, but it's a concept that involves cultural mixing. But if we unpack mestizaje by skin tone, and what I'm introducing here is to unpack mestizos in white, light brown, and dark brown. This is something we've been able to do in Latin America because the Latin American Public Opinion Project, the LAPOP, has introduced these type of questions in the last 4 waves of surveys. I know this is very uncomfortable to talk about. I feel weird talking about this, but it's realities. And what they did is they conducted this survey in which the interviewer actually had access to a color palette of 11 skin tones, and they had to identify the skin tone of the interviewer, and then they had to report their own skin tone. And you say, okay, well, we have that information. Let's try to understand how do Latin American societies look like. Well, what's interesting is that if you look at the pyramid, what you have is what we can identify in terms of research, 2 groups that are racially identically but culturally distinct. And that's the dark brown indigenous and the dark brown mestizo. And that allows us for almost experimental testing. Because if discrimination and inequalities are based on ethnicity, then all the discrimination should be against indigenous populations. But if levels of discrimination include elements of race and skin tone, then we should see levels of discrimination both against dark brown mestizos and dark brown indigenous. So I want to try to show you that this is not just a politically correct or someone who's been living here in the US for 10 years, who's aware of skin tones. No, you know, it has tremendous economic consequences. So this is data for Latin America. So these are 17 countries. This is the breakdown by group. And if you look at just the dark brown mestizos, that's 31% of the population. And if you add the indigenous population, that's 37%. For Mexico, it's around 40. For Peru, it's like 42. If you ask in surveys how people census in Peru, are you indigenous or not? Only 5% say so. In Mexico, only between 10 and 15% say so. There's this group, the dark brown mestizos. So who are they? We all recognize them. We all know them because they are the domestic workers, the millions of domestic workers. They are the chauffeurs. They are the bus drivers. They are the people who populate the informal sector of Latin America. We all know them. Those are indigenous people with indigenous phenotypical features, but who work in the periphery of Latin American societies and who pretty much remain in the shadow of our societies. So let me just, because I think I might be, I don't want to be short of time, so I want to show you the results. The question is, does this have economic consequences? Or is this just a classification that this guy is trying to bring us back to the colony? Well, no, to the caste system and to that type of thing. Let me just show you at the country level, at the individual level information. This is access to public goods. Because something we're testing is whether skin tone has an impact in terms of the access you have to public goods. Of course, I had 3 graphs, and here I only have 1, so you'll have to trust me. We tested first for access to water sources by country. These are 18 Latin American countries. And on the horizontal axis, initially, we had class. Imagine that graph, class. The line is very flat. The correlation coefficient is 0.001. Second figure, imagine one in which it's the proportion of indigenous population. The correlation coefficient is, the relationship is negative, but it's only 0.1, 0.2. This correlation coefficient, once you add skin tone, is 0.6. Now you would say these are just bivariate relationship. So what we did is we tested at the country level, at the individual level, 18 Latin American countries, 18,000 people, multi-level modeling, and pretty much what we find is very similar to what you have there. Societies which have a larger proportion of dark brown indigenous populations are significantly less likely to provide all kinds of public goods, education, health, pensions, access to sewage, access to water, so on and so forth. The question then is, what about the individual level? Well, what we find at the individual level is that if you are an indigenous person, you are significantly less likely to have access to any of these public goods and services than the rest of the population. But the variable that is statistically significant and the impact is large is also dark brown mestizos. So the fact that in most of the regression analysis, dark brown mestizos is significant, is negative, really tells us that this is not just a question of class-based or ethnic-based discrimination, but that there's a very strong race-based element. Now you would say, and this is what I hear most of the time from my economics colleagues when they say, well, but everything really boils down to class. I went to the National University in Mexico, so I know my Marxism, and I know that everything eventually boils down to class. Well, we have to disentangle, because remember what I said at the beginning, these are overlapping inequalities. So there's class, there's ethnicity, there's gender, there's race. And what we need to do is try to disentangle this in an interesting way. The best way to do this is to use experimental methods. That would be the next stage. So, but let me just share with you some of the simulations we did based on this multi-level modeling of 17 Latin American countries, 18,000 people. So this is access. This is one of the last graphs I show. This is individual access to sewage at different levels of wealth. And what you can see in the horizontal axis is that, and this is, we're measuring not just income, but wealth. What you can see there is that with the wealthier the individual, clearly the relationship is positive. The greater the level of wealth, the greater the access to sewage. This is true for water, this is true for education, for pensions, for healthcare, and so on and so forth. Now, what's pretty shocking, and this is what hasn't let me sleep for many months, is really the gap between the two extremes, the darker brown and the lighter skin tone. And this gap is persistent at all levels of income. So it really means that no matter what level of income, of wealth you have, there's always going to be that systematic gap between people with one skin tone and the other skin tone. I recognize that this is problematic because we have very few people who have fair skin who are poor, and the probability of having someone with indigenous phenotypical features attending Mexico's top universities is practically zero. So there's complications with this graph, and that's the reason why we have to move on to the experimental analysis. This is true also for Peru. This is not just Mexico. And I could show you similar types of graphs for many other countries in Latin America. In Chile, it's not as clear, but Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, this gap is always persistent, and it is always there. So conclusions. Race is the elephant in the room. Race is a major omitted variable in our studies of economic redistribution, and here specifically of public goods provision. Race doesn't trump class or ethnicity in most of our regressions. Income, wealth remains relevant, ethnicity is relevant, but so is race. And the graph I just showed you, controlling for wealth, race has an important impact. Third, but race is a component that cannot be subsumed into class and ethnicity. Race matters at the system, at the systemic, at the individual level. And finally, race is a case of preference falsification in countries with large indigenous populations. Few people talk about it. We don't like to talk about it in public, but everyone is perfectly aware of race categories in everyday forms of interactions. These private preferences that are not publicly expressed do have, I hope I showed, consequences for economic redistribution.
Well, thank you, the four of you. It was a very, very interesting comment. I think, in general, we get the sense that Latin America, despite becoming a little bit less unequal, Mexico seems to be lagging behind, and a lot of the fiscal programs and transfers don't seem to be working. So maybe before I really want to open the forum to questions, because there's a lot of you here, and I'm sure there's people wanting to ask questions. But just before we do that, maybe if you. Each of you might want to speak for 2 to 3 minutes just about this last point I think that Guillermo opened, that Guillermo mentions about how many of the policies that have been mentioned on this table might sort of attack one single dimension of inequality but not others. And I don't know what you have to say about that, if there's anything that is sort of that the other presenters might sort of talk more about in that respect.
Okay, just one brief comment on what, because that's what I was asked for, what was just presented, is that, well, I agree that race might be an issue that has been overlooked in many dimensions, but I think, I don't know, but my guess is that this, in the case of Mexico at least, this can be compounding two different effects. One is actually, which is the race effect, but the other thing is a territorial effect. because in Mexico, if you, I don't know if you have an idea of the map of Mexico, but if you have the idea the map of Mexico and you picture the level of income level, average income level, for example, in the north, in the center, and the southernmost part of the country is the very poor part of the country. So that's Chiapas, Guerrero, Oaxaca, and so on and so forth. So that in part has a territorial dimension, rural dimension as well, but also has the race dimension that Guillermo was talking about. So in some sense, there is and I remember having read a few years ago a study that was trying to actually to disentangle these effects. What part was due to the territorial effect, what part was due to these rural effects, and what part was due to race effect. And that study is, what it found is that most of that can be explained not by race, but by, first of all, territorial, regional aspects, and rural characteristics. So that means that probably in order to reduce inequality in that dimension, I mean, in that aspect, is probably has to do also with the territorial policy of reducing inequality levels in Mexico. That means probably investing a lot in infrastructure in the southernmost part of the country. And that's something that has been discussed for a while. President Fox, for example, talked about Plan Puebla Panama, which was precisely the idea was to invest a lot in the southern part of the country, because he in some sense, he understood somehow that something needs to be done there. And now, actually, with the discussion on Guerrero, on the situation on Ayotzinapa and so on, there has been another discussion on that dimension, because President Peña Nieto, for example, has announced something like specific program for the region, because it has been claimed that that's the level of poverty and inequality in that part of the country can have something to do with this kind of a situation of violence and inequality in that part of the country. So it's just to make, I don't want to dismiss the race issue, but I think that's part of it. But also, we also have this other dimension, which is a completely different policy, because that's a territorial policy. So in that sense, that probably is easier, and probably we feel less guilty somehow as Mexicans in terms of this discussion on race inequality. That could be more important than I just said. But I think this is something that we still should disentangle better than we have done so far.
Do you want to speak to this question?
Felipe, please.
No, perhaps just because the question specifically is about the race issue, and I think I do believe that Mexico, as a society, is a very racist society. But I think that what Gerardo said, I think there are two dimensions that if you improve the working in these two dimensions, you reduce inequality in these two dimensions, a lot of the effect of race would be reduced. And then, of course, there would be some margin left. But I think now it may be overstated because of these two elements. One is the territorial, and the other is just the way they enter in the labor market. If you look at, for example, differences in quality of education also, well, it also has a territorial dimension, but the quality of education, rural versus urban, and indigenous schools versus non-indigenous schools, there are massive differences in performance of the students. And I think this is accumulated through life, and then the labor market opportunities reflect that as well. So at the end, if you could attack these sources of inequality, you would bring the racial dimension to the right scale, which may be perhaps overstated. But even in that case, I think there would be a margin for race. I do believe that, and that is the case in the labor market. You see it in big cities, for example. There is clearly opportunities are definitely linked to racial characteristics.
And just, you mentioned the Ayotzinapa tragedy, and I was curious as to how, if we could just briefly talk about how inequality is related to violence, in the sense how you guys sort of find that link, if you see sort of a causal link or more a correlation between the two.
I think that's for Memo. I can say something, but I
Go
would
ahead.
like to hear Memo's first.
Well, very quickly, two things. If you assess the impact, and this has something to do with what you said, Tania, at the beginning about poverty. So if you look at intercartel wars in Mexico, you have to distinguish between 1990, 2006, and then the federal intervention to 2006 to the present. It's two very different realities. So if you just look at the first section, 1990 to 2006, sort of intercartel wars for a decade and a half, And you do sort of panel studies, which we've conducted, and you assess the correlates of the incidence of violence. Poverty is actually negatively associated with that wave. And really what drives, political different factors drive these differences in levels of intensity of violence in this period. But among economic factors, it's mostly local levels of inequality, the proportion of households with single moms, and the proportion of young population. And what does that really invite you to think? Well, if you think about the structure of many of these cartels, the cartels that subcontract defectors from the military and the police to create their private militias, and then the private militias who in turn subcontract young folks who work as foot soldiers. Those guys tend to be from large cities like Tijuana, like Acapulco, Reynosa, you name it. And these are territories of great inequality. Think about Acapulco. There's no place, Acapulco is certainly one of the cities with the largest, with the, I don't know what would be the Gini for, but it would be one of the highest in the country, together with Coajimalpa, which is kind of an explosion there. But think about Acapulco. Acapulco is the most violent city in Latin America right now, after a couple of cities in Honduras. And it's really that relationship of persistent inequalities that explains why so many young folks actually join many of these groups. There's lots of studies, individual level studies, not surveys at this moment. This is mostly ethnographic work, but very, very important work that really speaks about aspirational elements of young kids who grew. If you've been to Acapulco, it's the costera is like Miami, but beyond that, in the mountains, it's really, you feel you are in very poor territory. It's urban poverty. And those folks, for the most part, there's tons of interviews in which they say, this is a very dangerous profession. I'm not going to live very much if I join this profession. I'm not going to live to age 80 or 85. I may die at age 25. This is an 18-year-old speaking. But I'd rather live 10 years as a king. And by that, they mean the lifestyle of those tourists that they see in the costera all the time, than be a slave for 60 or 70 years. So there's issues of inequality that are important in the recruitment of many of these foot soldiers. In the second stage, now that violence has extended beyond the cities and has moved into rural areas, now poverty is becoming relevant. So it's not just a question of inequality, but also poverty.
Okay. Do you want to add anything to this?
No, I just would like to add, what we can see is we don't have the Gini for wealth, and my institution, together with the Universidad Iberoamericana, actually had like a panel survey, and this panel survey had all the assets. So we calculated the Gini for the only two observations we have, 2002 and 2004, and again, with all the problems that surveys normally have, and especially this other one also has some other problems. But the Gini for wealth was in 2002 0.69. In 2004 it was 0.71. So what we are talking about here is if you think 0.5 for income inequality is high, 0.7 is de la chingada. And this is something that there's no way it's not related to crime. Yeah.
You're underestimating.
Yes, I know. But this is something there's no way it's not related. It's hard to think. And I think it's underestimated for the reasons that Gerardo mentioned.
And the universal social security system that you were talking about would directly sort of tackle this problem, or?
Well, in principle, yeah, it has a lot of problems. I know the introduction of this thing has a lot of problems in the sense that it wouldn't immediately do that, obviously, because the implementation of this public policy would take years, for sure. But in principle will help, no matter what the race is. Yes, you will say, well, hospitals. One of the main factors why the Gini goes down is because of catastrophic expenditures in health and because of pensions in the elderly. And these are two very important determinants of income inequality. So the universal system will help out in these two things that are very important to decrease income inequality. Yes, you cannot, but to say that you need to have hospitals in these southern parts of the country with the quality, with enough quality in order for them to work. But eventually I would say that's the only way I see to have this reduction. Yes, the financial part can be debatable, but that's another issue.
But I think it is important to also to add to that this correlation between inequality and violence it's a two-way causality issue. So it is important also to stress that crime has actually reinforced particularly territorial inequalities, and has slowed down income convergence, and actually if you see successful stories like Monterrey or Ciudad Juárez where crime has gone down, it's because society is organized and they put pressure on authorities and so on, whereas in poor rural areas it is very easy to capture the authorities, to have weak institutions. So also violence has fed back into dynamics of inequality. So it's also important to say that it's not only that inequality causes violence, but now the situation of violence is also preventing inequalities from being successfully tackled.
Well, I have more questions, but I'm going to open it up to the floor so that we can gather 2 or 3 questions and then give the.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. It's really an honor to talk with so many experts. This is great. I'm curious what you think about a problem that's debatable in the United States about the financial sector being kind of too bloated, having making too much money off of kind of financial services, insurance, that's not necessarily production, and then that kind of skewing the GDP. I'm curious, A, if you think that's a problem in the United States, and then B, if that is similar in Mexico, if it is, what to do about it.
Following, maybe I'm going a little back in the discussion, but Guillermo talked about that we try everything. We try PRI, PAN, and nothing has changed. And there are some new papers and new good journalist articles that say that PRI is changing things, that they are worse off. Because it dismantled the cash management programs like Progresa, and has a really bad, political target programs like La Cruzada contra el Hambre. So where are we heading up, and where are we expecting the inequality?
Hi. I'm aware that Latin America has like a high profile of multiple nonprofits and foundations that do a lot of work in trying to alleviate these issues, including initiatives such as microfinance or access to credit and things like that. So I'm curious whether any of you are aware of whether any specific or in general nonprofits have any significant effect or measurable effect on poverty and inequality, and if not, why, and whether they can be doing something more or something else to alleviate and solve these kind of issues outside of just changing policy and things like that.
I want to say something about the first and the last question because they are somehow related. And I think that to me the financial sector is a big problem in Mexico, and in many dimensions, including growth. I have a paper with Fausto where we discuss this issue. But I think also has implications for inequality. And you can see that clearly when you see, for example, you ask about NGOs or other organizations that non-profit organizations. Well, that's how Compartamos started in Mexico. Compartamos is now a bank, It started as a non-for-profit organization, and now is the most profitable bank in Mexico. Incredibly, and it is because it does so. I think Compartamos could only be search in a place like Mexico, where you have this combination of a lot of poor people and a very lax regulation on the financial sector. So that's why Compartamos, I think, exists in Mexico. Compartamos, there is just a paper that was published in the last issue of the American Economic Journal, where what they show is, it's incredible what they do is they do like an experiment to see what's the reaction of poor people to a reduction in interest rates. But the reduction in interest rates goes from 100%, that's the interest rate they are charging, 100%. In nominal terms, which means we have an inflation of 4% per year, so that means a real interest rate of 96%. Of that to 90%. Okay? And what they find is that there is no effect on the demand for loans, for these micro loans. We're talking about loans for like $40 maybe. So these are loans that are taken by very poor people. And there is another paper which is a companion of this other paper where they try to analyze whether that has an impact on people that is taking all these loans. And this bank is growing very fast in Mexico because there is a lot of poor people that is taking these loans. But since they charge these huge interest rates, so what this paper finds is a paper actually financially supported by Compartamos. What they find is that there has almost no effect on real lives of people, basically. So they compare, they do a comparison, people that receive Compartamos loans, people that doesn't receive Compartamos loans, and they basically find no difference at all. So, but in the meantime, Compartamos is getting huge returns. So, and part of the reason has to do that all these microloans, for people that take these microloans, the return they get on their investment, part is due to the capital they sort of are able to acquire with these loans, but part is also due to their effort. So I think that what Compartamos is doing is actually extracting rents also from these people by taking not just the return on capital, but also part of the return on labor. So, and that's why people that uses these loans actually have no difference on their life in terms of their perspective, their economic possibilities, because it's so high that the interest rate. And if you see that paper actually, in that journal, where they have this journal where they have, I think, 6 papers on that precisely. Mexico being one of these case studies, and there is a summary table where they sort of compare the microloans, and it has nothing to do with the kind of microloans that they do, like for example in Bolivia, where they have a relatively better regulation, with what happens in Mexico, where they charge these huge interest rates. So that's not contributing in any way, I think, to reduce poverty, even though they are expanding very fast. So, and that has to do also with the regulation we have in Mexico, lack thereof.
Well, just to reinforce what Gerardo is saying is, one of there's another study that shows, like in Mexico, apart from Compartamos, there's an explosion of these pawn houses, and these pawn houses they were not that popular. I mean, they were not that spread out in the country. I grew up with only 2 pawn houses, which is Nacional Montepiedad y Montepío. That's it. Today we have thousands. In the very small and tiniest town, you will find one. And one of the real problems that Mexicans face day to day, and that's what they are willing to pay, this 100 or even higher % of interest rates, is because of liquidity problems. So for a public policy, we need something to solve the liquidity problem. The liquidity problems down in Mexico that families normally face it's really a problem. It's enormous. That's on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you are saying that NGOs. I'm not quite sure whether I got your question or something like that. There is also an explosion of NGOs in Mexico. NGOs were not that popular in Mexico. And today we are starting to have many NGOs and think tanks. I think we still have a challenge there to study how these things are working and what are the intentions of these things. Because what I've seen here, I'm just talking about what I have seen, and I have not made any study, and I don't think anyone is actually studying this thing. But you are seeing an explosion of NGOs, but coming from different interest groups. They represent interest groups. And they have become like how to say a portavoz, spokesperson from many interest groups. And they have a lot of access to the press. And this is becoming something interesting, very interesting. And not necessarily, these are NGOs that, are doing things for altruistic ways. In Mexico, it's not that, I wouldn't say that you would open an NGO because of fiscal benefit. No, I think you are opening up and there's an explosion for, making your point or pressure the government through the media.
Yeah, I want to make one general point. I think a lot of what has been discussed in terms of concentration of wealth at the top, this issue of the regulation of financial markets, and something that is at the core and has not been mentioned, and is at the core of the persistence of inequality, and has to do with if we think in terms more conceptual in terms of what Acemoglu Robinson, or more specifically North Weingast, called extractive versus inclusive societies. Basically, Mexico is a nature state. It's an extractive society, and what they call that one of the doorstep conditions, which is the rule of law, the impersonal application of norms. And I think a lot of what has been said relates to that, to the non-existence of a system, legal system, that actually applies the norms in an impersonal way. So basically, the law is applied depending on who you are. And I think that is at the core of a lot of the manifestations of inequality that we see, in a way, are related to that specific element, structural element in a Mexican society. And I think that relates to your point. And I think there is a regression in that sense, because when PAN came into power and so on, they didn't really manage, or I don't know if they even had the intention to do it, but they certainly didn't manage to make reforms in that sense. And certainly the PRI, historically has not been characterized by having an impersonal application of rules. Actually, it's in their genes to use the law politically. So I think there is a regression in that sense. But I think in general, historically, it's very difficult to say in very long term how to change inequality. But I think one element, something that we may know. So there are things we know. There's one thing in that respect. I always remember this anecdote. When maybe you know it, but Mikhail Gorbachev was at Harvard in the 90s, and he was asked what would be different today if in 1963, instead of John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated. And then he said, it's very difficult to have long-term counterfactual like that. And he said it's almost impossible. But I'm almost certain that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So I think this is interesting in the sense that there are things that even in very long term we can say, it's very difficult to have counterfactuals in very long term, but something we can know. And I think if there is a real effort to try to change the legal system in Mexico in that respect, a lot of the manifestations of inequality could be more successfully tackled. Yeah.
Just a final point on these questions of, I think it's a very insightful point on inequality related to the rule of law. There's a few institutions in which, in Mexico, we have reached some level of autonomy and impartiality. There's very few, and they more or less work well. This could be contentious, but as far as I understand, At one point, ELIFE, the Electoral Institute, more or less had a level of not necessarily it was non-partisan. It was never, but there were enough checks and balances, enough parties represented that it more or less worked or functioned well. The central bank. Conditional cash transfers, once they reached the point of in which you were able to move away most of the clientelistic elements. To the extent that we live in a partitocracy, I mean, we have to admit that. I mean, 3 political parties that do everything that is within their power to just raise any cost of entry for making representation more effective and for the system to be more inclusive. It would be quite a pity if we would start dismantling some of the few things, the islands of autonomy, impartiality that we've conquered. And one of them would be questions of conditional cash transfer programs. But I know this would be dangerous territory where I'm moving into, because 2 of our panelists here have co-authored with Santiago Levy, and they're very close to him. But let me just, for the sake of argument here, we're living in a period in which we're so in love with conditional cash transfer programs that we've become acritical. And I think we've come to a point in which, they have, poverty alleviation consequences, but as soon as there's a major macro crisis or whatever you gain, gone. So you need structural features, be more critical about the program. And if you look into the program, let me just give you one example. The way women are identified. So what's the role of women in this program? Women, as such, are irrelevant to the program. They are relevant as long as they become mothers. So if you take care of the kid, of the child, and make sure he or she goes to school, make sure he or she goes to the health clinic. I wish it was he and she, because I bet you that I don't know if there's studies, maybe there's a bias and it's mostly the boys who tend to go to school. So, and understanding women as mothers, there's a lot that you leave out in these programs, and it can be regressive in terms of the other dimensions of inequality, gender inequalities. And the second point is that, let's say, a kid successfully goes through, 10 years, goes to school and whatever, thanks to these conditional cash transfer programs. You look at some of the teachers and some of the staff they're going to learn in school, and you say, gee, they're probably wasting 5 years of their life. They manage to get access to the health clinic, and they may go and have a problem with the arm, and they chop off their leg, because that's the type of doctors you will have. Once they get out into the labor market, because of race-based discrimination, they'll end up with second and third-tier jobs. So it's more structural than just the conditional cash transfer program. And if we don't reform the other segments, it'll be very difficult for these type of programs to have long-term consequences, let alone inequality. I'm just talking about poverty here.
Okay, there were more questions. No? Yes.
You mentioned the informal economy and how large that is, 66%, whatever. Some people say that people get into the informal economy and move to alleviate poverty and move to more formal type things, but it sounds like that really doesn't happen. And then you mentioned that the informal economy of the rich. What are those examples? Or why is the economy that large, and what's happening to change that? It might tie into the whole rule of law and the whole ideas of how do you get things regulated rather than all informal.
Well, very quickly, it depends how you define formality or informality. I know that's a very complex, and we acknowledge it's a very complex concept. We were like very practical in a way that's saying that we define informality whether you are registering before the authorities or not. In that sense is that we define that. And that's what we were just saying right there, is that you have a lot of people that are not registered before the authorities. Yes, you have a lot of street vendors that are not registered before the authorities, but you also have a lot of rich people, a lot of lawyers, a lot of medical doctors, and you have a lot of executives that are not registered before the authorities sometimes. So that's what we are actually saying, that is not only a street vendor phenomenon. We have evidence right now of large firms that actually are hiring high executives not in the payroll that they have. They are just hiring them through what we call honorarios, and that's a form of informality. High executives, top-level executives. That's what we are saying. There's a way to circumvent these kind of things. So avoidance, obviously, for avoidance you need lawyers, you need accountants, you need this kind of thing. So only the rich guys have the money for that. That's what I was saying, that is regressive.
There was one question.
I have a question. So I'm still trying to put it together, but I guess being Mexican American here in Chicago, I often kind of struggle between, caring for these two countries and how we do our relations with each other, and knowing that the relations here in the U.S. often hurt, some of the policies and people in Mexico. I guess, how can the U.S. and also the Mexican population impact sort of the racial and income inequality in Mexico?
That requires some thinking. So
The question is how the Mexico-U.S. relationship
could
help.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is when talking about this issue of, for example, of rule of law. I mean, there are certain things that, for example, through NAFTA, things related to protection of property rights or investment or so on, when you go to a supranational agreement and you start imposing certain rules, that then the cost of actually not respecting those rules is very high, because then you have a commitment with other with the international counterpart. So I think in a way this idea of thinking of solving coordination, collective action problems by having these type of agreements that that in a way are mutually beneficial for two countries, but then also they imposed limits, or they imposed restrictions on what the national government can do, and that is a good reason to, a good argument to use that as a leverage internally to impose rules that then cannot be violated later. I can see that, for example, now in accession countries to the EU, how the incentive of getting into the EU makes people self-impose certain constraints that are actually positive, and that politically it would be impossible to impose if you only look at the internal political dynamics. So I think in that sense, perhaps Mexico should use a little bit more this idea of bilateral agreements to try to solve things that politically are complicated internally.
And also, this might not be, might be unrelated, but anyway, something that has always struck me is that Mexican authorities, especially after 2000, I remember President Fox and Gerardo was saying, and I think Luís Felipe also was saying, that remittances were very important for, alleviating poverty and decreasing a little bit inequality, income inequality. But I remember that in the presidential address 2002 for Fox, one of his points in that presidential address, and I was really struck because of that, is that one of his achievements was that remittances went up. So this has become like a triumph of politicians in Mexico, which, when you think about it truly, that's a failure. You are expelling people, and then you praise that you have high remittances. Even the media is always saying remittances went down as if the government was to blame. Well, obviously, remittances went down because the U.S. economy went down, and not because we created jobs and people started to, stop coming here. We also have to change the political discourse and have to be very careful when we talk about these kind of things.
Sure. That's actually something that I keep thinking about. I live in Cicero, which is west side of Chicago, and it's mostly a Mexican community. And you know, you had the consulado coming in and basically talking about their 3-for-1 program and, you know, encouraging people to send money back to Mexico, and it's a great thing. But like you mentioned, when you have folks who are actually trying to, you know, encourage more conversation between, you know, the Mexican government and themselves, and trying to like really understand, hey, what are our politics? How is this like better impacting our community? And I think a conversation on Ayotzinapa came up, and you know, I think when the Mexican government is encouraging people to send back money, but can't even be accountable for their actions, can't talk to their people about what's really happening, I think that's extremely disturbing. So, you know, being here, like, how can we have those better conversations, you know?
But you see, I think what we've lived in the past 4 or 5 months after the Tlatlaya and the Ayotzinapa cases are quite educational, because it gets to a point in which, as voters, as Mexican voters, we get frustrated because it just, the message doesn't get through. But then the economy says, the weekly magazine says, they just don't get it, that they don't get it. And everyone starts, you know, the economy suddenly says it's impunity and corruption. I mean, I could say it, well, Gerardo is much more influential than me, he could say it, but still, they don't hear it. But when the Economist says it, when the Wall Street Journal says it, now when we have the Inter-American courts moving in, if they say, look, you know, a few intellectuals in Mexico could say that, you know, the investigation of the Attorney General is exemplary. It's the best we've done in Mexico. Well, if the Inter-American Court says, really, is that as good as you can do? Believe me, things will get moving. Unfortunately, voters, sometimes we don't have as much influence as the international community, or when thousands and millions take to the streets. I'm not advocating this, but when people take up arms. So when did Mexico have, if you just think electorally, politically, if you think about the most important political reforms in the history of Mexico, 78, 94, 96, they took place just immediately after, following armed insurgencies. Do we have to wait for that? No, we don't. And that's why I think it's better the combination of international and domestic civil society pressuring, because they do seem to be sensitive to those issues, specifically on questions of corruption and impunity that are so complicated, because the state has to recognize its complicity in all these things, and they don't recognize it. How can we do it? How can we make them accountable? Well, I think the international pressure can do a lot. And I think you just gave a fantastic example. I'm sending money. The whole idea of no taxation without representation, I keep on sending money. What Fausto is saying, you're bragging about us. Okay, what are the terms in which we can speak up or not? I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but you guys are welcome to come and talk to the panel. Thank you again for this really, really interesting conversation, and it just, I think, opened up more questions than answers, but that's a good thing. Well, bye.